If you know you've got 3 people that you need to bake all the muffins, it'd be pretty hard to not remember that you've got to pay them a salary.
So why is it operational expenses, not just expenses? It's because we separate the operations of the business, running it, from the product expenses. And that's why 60 cents of beans and 10 cents of milk turns into a $4 coffee. We've got to pay for the rent of the cafe and the wage of the charming barista that makes it for you. And again, we do some assumptions and maths.
Understanding operating expenses can be a bit tricky because sometimes you don't know what all the expenses are that you're going to have. So the operating expenses are really all the different things I'm going to have to pay for to run my business at the end of the day. So the biggest type of operating expense is typically your staff costs or your labor costs. And again, figuring out how much you're going to be paying for staff, you need to break it down to the simple building blocks. You need to figure out how much time you're going to need in labor. If we're talking about our muffin and coffee stand, we know we're going to need people to bake the muffins and brew the coffee. It might be one person if it's a really small stand. Say I need 20 hours of labor a day. So maybe it's 2 people on 10-hour shifts or 4 people on 5-hour shifts. It doesn't matter. How much labor do I need? How much will I have to pay for that labor will give you your labor expense.
What are some of the inputs we'll need for our staff costs? First thing I can think of is wages per hour. So what's it going to cost us for each employee, to pay each employee per hour? Let's assume it's $25 an hour in year 1, because costs go up, $25.75 in year 2, and in year 3 it's $26.52. And if you actually look at the formula that's been put in here, that's been grown by the 3% inflation, which is that same input in row 17. The next thing we want to think about is how much staff we'll need. So don't think about in terms of how many people you'll need, but think about in terms of how many man hours you'll need. You know, you need people to bake the muffins, so maybe you'll have cooking hours per day, so how much for the staff that does all the cooking, and then how much staff you need for the serving. So we can break down those assumptions. So let's think how many hours we'll need someone to cook, cooking hours per day, and let's say we need someone baking muffins for 3 hours. We're open 5 hours a day, so we need to have someone manning the coffee cart 5 hours a day. We'll add that same assumption, 5. And then we also know we need people to clean up at the end of the day. So let's call it pack up, and let's assume that's another hour. So maybe half an hour in the morning, half an hour at the end of the day.
So notice in this model, we've got like a 9-hour workday. This is one of these things where the model in theory land is telling us some very practical realities about the kind of business we're going to run. Do we want to be on our feet 9 hours a day?
Okay. So in terms of calculating our employee expenses, let's figure out how many hours a day we've got. We know we've got 3 hours cooking, plus 5 hours serving, plus another hour for packing up and down. So that's 9 hours a day, times the hourly rate of $25 an hour. And now, if we enter that formula in, it gives us $225. Now that doesn't make a whole lot of sense when, you know, we're dealing in the tens of thousands for our profit margin, because we know that intuitively employee expenses are one of our larger expense categories. So what's wrong with the formula? Hang on, the cash flow is in the unit of time is a year, but I'm coming up with a daily cost. So what I need to do is convert that formula to be an annual figure. So if I know that's a daily cost, I've got to multiply that by 5 days a week, and we know we've got 45 weeks a year. So that, by multiplying it by 5 and another 45, we should get an annualized figure, and that cost of $50,000 is looking high, but quite accurate, and we'd expect it to take up a big chunk of our gross profit. It is one of the larger expenses we can expect in a business. So if we copy that formula over, we're getting a slight increase on our employee expenses each year because of the inflationary factor.
You've probably noticed that wage costs are an absurdly large proportion of any business, and you kind of can't get away from it. This is why cutting jobs is such an attractive thing for management consultants in big companies. You save a huge amount of money really easily. It also shows us why it's really smart to make every hour of employee time count. So an expensive bit of gear like a nice laptop is going to be infinitely cheaper than having a staff member take a long time to do their job over the course of a year.
That's right. The best way to start is to get a very comprehensive P&L with every conceivable line item you could have for, different expenses incurred in running a business. Stationery, magazine subscriptions. It can be very small line items, but whatever it is, you can go through line item by line item and figure out what else you need. Maybe if you're making muffins, you want to buy new recipes every month. That's got to be paid for somewhere. That's part of your operating expenses. A good place to start is looking at a profit and loss statement from a similar business that's quite detailed, almost like a profit and loss ledger that actually goes into building up your financial statements. You can find that by going to talk to someone else in a similar industry. You can even find examples of operating expense budgets online. So you just have to think about how those costs relate to your business, and you also need to think about how those costs will change over time. If my parents are letting me use their garage to bake my muffins, but I know they're selling the house in a year and I'm going to have to find other premises, I will need to start budgeting for rent at some point in time.
Let's go back, and when we think about all the other operating costs we've got, let's just jot them all down. So we're going to have some marketing costs. We know we want to print some flyers. Let's think about rent. We know we've got to pay rent per month because that's how we pay our rent. Mobile phone plans are also charged on a monthly basis. We might decide we want to have a 1300 number. We're probably going to want a website, insurance. Let's assume we've done all of our research and we've understood that it's going to cost us $500 in year one, $250 in year two, and another $215 in year three. For rent, let's say we've got monthly rent of $1,000, but we know that it's probably fair to assume that the landlord's going to want to increase our rent, at least on an annual basis. So let's assume he does it by 3%. Be lucky if he does it by 3%. And now we've come to insurance. And the insurance quote I've got is actually not a monthly cost. It's actually an annual cost. Typically, insurance charges you per year. So let's assume our insurance is $1,000 a year. And let's just be very clear that it's a yearly cost. Right, so $1,000 a year, and we know that the insurance company is going to raise our premium. We're just assuming it goes up by inflation. So it doesn't matter what unit of time you use to put in for your assumptions. What really matters is when you're generating the outputs, they're all converted to a standard unit of time. So if some of the operating costs are monthly, some are yearly, some are daily, it doesn't matter as long as you're consistent in generating the same unit of time for your outputs. I would recommend thinking about operating costs in the way that's most logical for each line item. So it doesn't make sense to think about daily rent unless you pay your rent daily. Okay, so now we've got our basic operating cost assumptions. Let's go back and see how it all translates in our cash flow. Okay, so let's think about marketing. We've put $500 worth of flyers in year one, so that's an annual figure, so happy pulling that over. And we can just copy that formula over. It just pulls the cell immediately to the right of the previous. Rent, let's go back and calculate our rent. So we've inputted our rent on a monthly basis. So we know we're going to be operating roughly 12 months of the year. Our landlord doesn't really care that we're not operating that whole time. We're going to have to pay for the full 12 months, our annual rent. We can copy that same formula over and it'll pull the assumptions from one cell to the right. Insurance, let's go back. Now our insurance is an annual cost, so an annual input, so we don't need to multiply that by 12. We just draw that annual number, $1,000 in year one. Electricity is inputted on a quarterly basis, so we know that there are 4 quarters in a year. So instead of multiplying by 12, let's multiply by 4. So sometimes you can add a contingency line item if you just want to make sure you've got enough of a buffer. So basically, to calculate your contingency, you need to basically take the sum of all your costs, go back to our assumptions and grab the 10% contingency and multiply it by that 10%. And we'll copy that formula over. And then types in a formula equals sum. And then shift and the up arrow key within the brackets to select all the cells you want. Copy that formula over. We can see our operating expenses are in the 70,000s.
So once you've gotten to this point in the model, you know your revenues, you know the cost of goods sold, which tells you what your gross profit is. We also know our operating expenses. So if we take our gross profit and deduct our operating expenses, we get something called our operating profit, or EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. What does the actual operations of my business give me as profit at the end of the day, based on how much revenue I've got, what it actually costs me to sell my product, and then all the other costs that go with marketing that product, paying for the staff I need to make the product and sell that product, and all the other expenses that go into running my business.
We know that EBITDA is our gross profit minus our operating expenses, and it gives us EBITDA in year one of just under $9,000. Copying the formula over, year two, $42,000, and year three, $95,000. Now our EBITDA is going up quite significantly because, as we can see, our revenue is going up greater than our costs. And that is coming out in our EBITDA margin, which in year one is only 7%, but because of the increased profits in year two and three, it goes up to 24%, then 38%. Now that's the direction we want our margins to go in.
By this point, the cafe owners in the audience will have learned that we don't know anything about running a cafe. 7, 24 and 38% margins are completely nuts. Many cafes don't even make a profit. But this is really valuable, right? We can ask other cafe owners what they expect their margins to be like and then go and tweak our assumptions so that the margins make sense, which means that we're validating those assumptions.
The profit at the end of the day flows to you if you own that business. So you might think, I don't need a salary because I'm getting, $40,000 a year of profit from my business. If your labor is required to generate that profit, it should be included as salary. If something were to happen to you and someone else were to take over the business, they would have to either do that job themselves or find someone else to do it. So it is a cost to the business.
Okay, so we've just totaled up our wage costs, our operational costs, and a little like 10% contingency, and minus that number from our revenue, which finally gives us the most important number in this spreadsheet: profit.
So at the end of the day, before taking into account how you've chosen to finance the business or whether you'll pay taxes or not, how profitable is it for me to operate my business on an ongoing basis? That's effectively what your EBITDA tells you.
This is a really exciting number, not just because you get to take the money home at the end of each year, but also because it's the number that eValuator uses if you sell the business. We'll get to that later.
So if you get to this point in the model and you've really figured out your model's not profitable at all, it might be a bit disheartening. But all I can probably say is better to find out now than after you've gone and raised investment for your business or mortgaged your house. And a lot of early stage businesses pivot. It's very common, and that's really the job of the founder and the entrepreneur, to figure out, how do I best chart this course? And what a model lets you do is figure out how the different strategies will look in terms of the numbers and the overall profit for the business.